Good. Yeah, but at least free energy principle is a theory. So there are only two contributions that functional neuroimaging has made to the world, maybe three. So one contribution that the whole cognitive neuroscience business has made to the world, let's say four. There are four contributions. The first contribution is simple and complex cells have been implemented as the first layer, so as the convolutional layer in neural networks. Since then, neural networks work better. That's the whole deep learning hype. Second contribution that functional MRI has made is that it was shown that in humans there is something called visual cortex, and that visual cortex is rhythmotopically organized. That's the second contribution that cognitive neuroscience has made. Third contribution that cognitive neuroscience has made is the development of random field theory for statistical inference and multiple testing correction. That's the Worsley-Friston work. And the fourth contribution that cognitive neuroimaging has made is to start developing a general theory of the brain, which is called free energy principle. These are the only contributions that cognitive neuroscience has ever made. All the rest is just paper and it's just careers. Anyway, that said, let's go on with foundations of experimental design. So we are now going into more topics that are closer to. I'm just trying to change this here. That are closer to actually doing cognitive neuroscience and analyzing data from cognitive neuroscience experiments. And the first thing is to talk about experimental design. And there we will discuss two kind of major topics, namely the first thing, cognitive subtraction, or the general question of what one can do with fMRI and the general analysis pipelines that have been proposed for fMRI data. That's cognitive subtraction. The other thing that we will discuss is essentially how to in time place a stimuli, and that's this block design, event-related design, and mixed design business. Personally, I think the first part is much more important than the second part. Although in a practical setting, people will always rather ask, how should I order my stimuli, rather than what am I doing with this entire experiment? It doesn't make sense to make this experiment at all. Cognitive subtraction. So that's a term also popularized by Carl Friston in the 1990s. But maybe also other people have definitely used this term. And it rests on the idea that there are two principles of functional brain anatomy, also popularized by Carl Friston in the 1990s, but also much older in terms of the general idea. And these two principles are functional segregation and functional integration. And what do these two terms refer to? So this is kind of a slide that has things on it to memorize them. So functional segregation refers to the idea that different brain regions are specialized for different cognitive functions. Yeah? So that, and you've just went over that in your functional neuroanatomy, that there are areas in the brain that relate to vision, there are areas in the brain that relate to audition, so auditory cortex, and then the hope is that there are also specialized regions for more particular more particularly cognitive functions, such as representing value. Where's value in the brain? Value, where is value? Ventral medial prefrontal cortex. At least that's the decision neuroscience story about value, whatever they mean by value. So the idea is that there are brain regions that are specialized for certain functions. And this idea is, of course, based on the anatomical grouping together of neural populations with similar functions. Again, this is, of course, closely inspired by vision, so that There are neurons that respond to basic visual properties, or there is something called V1 that always lights up in fMRI experiments when you show a visual stimulus, and other brain areas do not light up as much. And so there's definitely some grouping together of neural populations with some similar functions, specifically in the sensory domains. Of course, this can be extended, and this was, I think, the work by Fodor, that you have something like cognitive modularity. This is something that is very prominent also in cognitive psychology and the whole business of talking about cognition, so that there are things like working memory, decision-making, attention. And in terms of functional segregation, this would mean that there are brain areas that do attention, that do value, that do decision-making, and so on. Yeah? And that's essentially also what brain mapping studies allow you to do, and how that is done we will talk about in more in a bit in cognitive subtraction. But essentially the result of a GLM analysis of the brain, so where you get these blobs that you've seen in your papers, or the result of a classifier analysis of the brain with some regions of interest, is that certain areas of the brain are specialized in something, or at least in representing some external information, or even weaker, some brain areas correlate more, or are stochastically more associated with certain things than with others. So that's functional segregation. Functional integration refers to the fact that these functional segregated areas, of course, also talk to each other in the sense that they are covered and interact. One can call this the connectivity between brain areas, and functional integration is also the basic results that you get of, for example, resting state studies where you do correlations, because then you look at this the stochastic dependencies between two time series from two different origins. Or things like PPI, which we will discuss in January, or DCM, which we will discuss in the summer. So the basic idea about these two principles is that they are not independent but interdependent, so that the functional specialization of a brain area depends on its connectivity. So the prime example, if you think more in neuron terms, is that if you have a neuron that responds primarily to faces, then it responds to faces because the input it gets is from cells that detect eyes, mouths, and noses, or whatever. And that you get this functional specialization because of the functional integrative processes that are the input to this area. Yeah, so it's not that the brain is organ, or that the brain works based on functional segregation only, and that's it, because the functional segregation needs functional integration to come about. And it's also not the case that there's only functional integration and no specialization of brain areas, because there is. I mean, that's empirically has been shown, and also it might be an organizing. It is just an organizing principle of the brain. So essentially, like, the role of a neuron in a network depends on its function specialization. So if you have a face selective neuron, then of course what it does in the entire neural network is depending on how it's specialized. So one area of the brain exerts its role only in the network. So if you have something like the fusiform face area, if there would just be a fusiform face area, but it would not be interacting with other brain regions that, for example, relate to motor preparation processes to signal that you've detected a face, then also the FFA would not be meaningful. Yeah, so it's not either or, functional segregation or functional integration, but both processes are kind of, both principles are at work. And this, of course, has been debated over the years. So if you look into these more history of neuroscience, then at one point it was a lot more on functional integration, and then people did some experiments and showed that when there is some specialization and so on, this goes a little bit back and forth. And I think by now people appreciate that there is some specialization in the brain, but of course that the specialization only makes sense in terms of network interactions. And what I really want to stress is that if you set out, and this is sometimes surprising when people start doing what I've seen, of course, many times, that people start new in cognitive neuroimaging. You should think about the analysis that you're doing with your data in the beginning, because you already know what the result is when you know what kind of analysis you're doing. If you're doing a GLM analysis or an MBPA analysis, you will contribute to functional segregation. If you're doing a DCM analysis, the way it's set up in SPM, you will contribute to functional integration. And so don't be disappointed that if after you do a GLM analysis, you have some brain areas that are more involved in one task than the other task, and that this doesn't explain how the brain works. But you knew that from the beginning if you had understood GLM before you started your experiment. Yeah. So data analysis is kind of the lens that you look at things, and if you look at it through a certain lens, then you will make certain statements with your study. Now, what is cognitive subtraction then? Cognitive subtraction relates to functional segregation, so that's just how it is. It's also closely related to brain mapping. Remember that the organization for cognitive neuroscientists using fMRI and EEG is still the Organization for Human Brain Mapping. Cognitive subtraction rests on the idea of cognitive processes as discussed in psychology, and is a method for cognitive process mapping, namely identifying brain areas that implement certain cognitive processes. Cognitive subtraction is based on the idea of pure insertion, meaning that if you combine a number of cognitive processes in a task, this does not change the other cognitive processes. So if you have, let's say, two cognitive processes going on when you have to do a certain task, and then you manipulate the task a little bit so that a third cognitive process is necessary, this doesn't change that you have to do these first two cognitive processes. I will make this a little bit more explicit in a second. What this whole cognitive subtraction approach requires is a task analysis. So if you design a task, a cognitive task for participants to perform, then if you want to do a cognitive subtraction approach using either, for example, GLM analysis of MRI data or ERP analysis of EEG data, or frequency analysis of EEG data or whatever, you can only do that properly if you do a task analysis and explicitly state what the cognitive processes are that you think are involved. People shy away from that all the time in the literature, so this is why a lot of cognitive neuroimaging papers are then fairly unclear in what they actually want to say, because they don't dare to say these are the cognitive processes. So let's look a little bit closer onto cognitive subtraction approaches. So the first thing, if you want to do an fMRI experiment or an EEG experiment, would be, of course, in cognitive neuroimaging, not a resting state experiment, would be to come up with a task. For example, so what kind of tasks do you have in your papers that you read? Yeah, but that's the output, but what kind of, so tomorrow you're doing something with Adrian, so what are the tasks in these experiments? Or is everybody who's doing something tomorrow is not here today because they are too busy preparing the things, because on Saturday there was the big party and Sunday was out, so we cannot come in on Monday. So
the one tomorrow is about lesions. The one tomorrow, the presentation is about lesions.
And any tasks there? Or?
Pictures, emotions.
Oh, so
It's not neglect too.
Okay, so but you read now some papers with fMRI and EEG, and what kind of tasks did they do? Just an example.
Cognitive tasks?
Cognitive tasks?
Yeah.
Line bisection task.
Line bisection task. So how does that work?
Well, you have lines, and well, it's usually used to assess neglect, like if people have neglect or not, and they are presented with a line, and they have to like identify the middle point
Okay.
of this line.
Good. So that would be the task. Do they do a control task? I guess not, because it's a neglect task, and then the control is actually the normal participants. But what we are talking about here is the typical cognitive neuroscience experiments where you put healthy people into the scanner and they do two tasks, namely a task and a control task, or possibly more. Have you read something like that?
For example, we had this paper about emotion,
Mm-hmm.
and there were people who were presented with stimuli. For example, they had to identify whether the person was happy, angry, or fearful, and there were different only face, body, and the whole, like whether the whole emotion, like does it count?
Yep. That is kind of what I'm after. So the task. So I guess what happened there is that it's kind of a 2x3 design or something, where you had just face, the whole body, and motion.
And the face, like body, and then face and body together.
Okay. So what they essentially wanted to figure out is they, in this case, used a cognitive subtraction task where they wanted to fiddle out the emotion judgment cognitive process. To make this a little bit simpler, what you described there, that would be the task that you have to do a judgment on what kind of emotion is this face, and then the control task would be that you just show a neutral face or something. Yeah? The typical thing is that what they also should have done, and I guess they didn't do, and this was why this paper was a little bit hard to read, is that they should, next to their different conditions, they should write what cognitive processes they think are involved. So, for example, the cognitive process, when you make the judgment, is this a fearful or angry or whatever face, is one cognitive process could be face perception, so you need to identify a face, then emotion categorization, so angry, fearful, or whatever, and then motor preparation or response selection. These would be cognitive processes, and then you should write, okay, these cognitive processes are involved in making this judgment, and then you can go on and either then say, you can do a couple of things. You can either say what additional processes you have in your body task, or whether you actually don't follow the pure insertion task and think that the body somehow affects the judgment. In any case, what would be helpful if all people who do these kind of experiments were explicit about the cognitive processes that are induced by the task, because then it's much easier to make sense also of the subtraction analysis that they then do in terms of GLM analysis or ERP comparisons. I'll give you a clearer example in a second for a task and a control task. But the important thing is, if you develop a task like judging the fear or whatever, or judging the emotion of a face stimulus, you have to, in the sense of cognitive brain mapping, you have to explicitly say what the cognitive processes are that are involved. Then, in the second step, people do the task and the control task. And what I forgot to say is that you should design an experiment if you want to find the neural correlate of a cognitive process of interest, is that your task involves, let's say, n cognitive processes and the cognitive process of interest. Your control task, however, only involves these n cognitive processes, not your cognitive process of interest. So what the task requires in addition to your control task is the cognitive process of interest. Then you let people perform task and control task, And then you identify, for example, with fMRI, the voxels that have a larger bold signal for the task versus the control task. And because the task requires these cognitive processes and the cognitive process of interest, and the control task requires all other cognitive processes, but not the cognitive process of interest, you can then say these voxels that have a larger bold signal during the task then in the control task relate to the cognitive process of interest. So you can map the cognitive process of interest to a certain brain area. Yeah, and then you can conclude that the brain area that was more active for the task than for the control task implements the cognitive process of interest. So that's the logic of cognitive subtraction. Here is an example for that. This is just face perception. So here essentially you can do cognitive subtraction also using passive tasks where people don't have to do anything, but you just show them something and you just want to figure out if they perceive a face, what brain areas go on. Then this would be the task, and as control tasks you could show them, for example, degraded stimuli, or you could show them non-face tasks. And this is kind of an old finding from Nancy Cambridge's lab about the fusiform face area, which had been identified in the 80s already using PET, but was identified in the 90s using fMRI, where they presented faces and these scrambled faces to participants and found that in the fusiform face area there's more activity for faces rather than the scrambled faces. And they also compared faces to houses and again found that in this brain area faces are more active than houses. So that's kind of the general idea about cognitive subtraction. So you design a task that requires cognitive process and a cognitive process of interest, and you have a control task that requires the same cognitive process but not a control task. And I don't know whether you already wanted to raise your hand and say but, and if you were to, that would be okay, because there are a number of things with this approach. First thing is, what's a cognitive process? So I've been using this word now and say attention is a cognitive process, decision making is a cognitive process, visual perception is a cognitive process. The thing is, there is no real definition of what a cognitive process is in psychology, because psychologists, I think they really hate defining things. They sometimes do, but then they have definitions that go on for a paragraph or so on. Yes, so it's not really clear what cognitive processes are. Nevertheless, there are kind of a number of things that are always referred to as cognitive processes, and these are the ones that I mentioned. Then, and this is what people of course also hate to do, is to say, okay, I think that in this task the following cognitive processes are involved. Because as soon as you say that, you know that somebody in the audience will sit there and say, but isn't also if I say, okay, face perception, so what is face perception? Isn't also the cognitive process of identifying lines and circles, is that not also involved in the task? So this is why people don't want to say what cognitive processes they think are involved, because they think that then somebody will say, but I think something else is involved. One thing that one can debate is, of course, whether this pure insertion assumption is possible, so that if you add more and more cognitive processes, that the other cognitive processes are not involved. So, for example, if you have to do a number of things. So, for example, one thing that what people always really hope is that, for example, perceptual processes are altered if you get a reward or if you learn something that is associated with that. And that's, I think that's a little bit misguided, but nevertheless, that's how a lot of perceptual decision-making experiments work, that people hope that because now identifying something, for example, leftward motion is rewarded, that then people somehow perceive things differently and hence report some other things. So that's kind of where people hope that the pure insertion assumption is not reasonable. I think that's I think really these training experiments where people get trained on certain things and then the hope is that they perceive something differently, I think that's more kind of an attentional effect, in the sense that then people behave the way that they were trained, but if they were asked to just tell what they perceive in clear terms, then I think the perception is not really altered, because that would take a little more. More basic question is, of course, why at all should a cognitive process that is added during a task yield a larger bold signal? Why? Maybe it also yields a lower bold signal, whatever. So these are things that, of course, are easy to use as attacks on the cognitive subtraction approach. But then I personally think it would help a lot if those people, and also me when I do certain experiments, for example, we now with one of the PhD students doing this work on the on comparing ERPs in different bandit settings, so where people only explore and where people also explore and exploit. It helps a lot to make clear what our interpretation of these differences is that we see. If we say, okay, we think when people do the task, this task, then they do these processes. When they do this task, we think they do these and these processes. So the difference means that the difference is reflected, means that it's this cognitive process and not some other. So it would help if people would do many more task analysis and explicitly talk about the cognitive processes. One can go a little bit beyond cognitive subtractions, for example, with factorial designs, which alleviate the pure insertion assumption, so that a difference between two conditions can be modulated by another factor, so in this case another cognitive process. So then one gets away, one doesn't have to have this pure insertion assumption anymore, and I guess this was the idea behind this with the body, that somehow if the body is there, the emotional judgment is different. I would assume that something like this was the idea, hence they did this factorial design. Another thing that one can do if one wants to go beyond cognitive subtraction is to get away a little bit from this talking about cognitive processes, to go to more model-based analysis that actually don't get away with, so they don't do away, or the cognitive process idea is not completely taken out of this thing, but at least the cognitive process is formalized and quantitatively described. So it's not something that exists purely in words, but it also exists in equations, and it also can have numbers attached to it, so you can have more or less of something, which in very basic forms you can of course also have without numbers attached, but with numbers attached, first of all, you're more precise, and second, you are explicitly quantitative. Nevertheless, of course, also with model-based analysis, you do brain mapping. So you say this cognitive process, for example, what we are doing in one of the experiments is that we are measuring, so we are quantifying Bayesian surprise when people learn essentially about their environment. And then we have this readout that we can correlate with brain data, and the Bayesian surprise essentially in terms of probabilistic modeling means model update, so subjective model update, and then we have a number that describes the internal the update of an internal model. And then we can find this brain area correlates with that. So it's not really something different than the cognitive subtraction approach. The only difference is that on the one hand we are maybe looking at different cognitive processes, and the other is that we can quantify things a little bit more. But this is also what should be kept in mind. So if people say, okay, there have been all these factorial designs and so on, but now we do computational modeling. I mean, it's still brain mapping. You still associate one brain area with representing or doing one certain function. Maybe you can describe the function a little bit more explicitly using models, so computational models, but than just by talking about it. But then never forget that the models also implement intuitions, and these intuitions still play a role. Let me have a look. Yeah, so this is actually really, really important. So I don't know, what do you think? Have you read in your papers something about cognitive subtraction, and have you read task design? Task analysis, I mean, not a task design, but did they ever talk about the cognitive process they think they are involved? For example, in your classifier papers on EG or something, emotion classification. But in the end, what people do is statistical tests between two conditions, right? So that's what always happens. And the question is, why do they do this statistical test? Why do they do this subtraction approach between two things? Then because they say in this condition, there was more compared to this. And the question is, yeah, that's great, but what does that mean? Well, what they implicitly mean is that this more is due to the fact that in this condition, something more was required. And this something more was, of course, the cognitive process of doing this condition in comparison to another condition. And if that would be explicitly communicated, then of course it would be much easier to understand what people mean, but then it would also be a little bit less mystical, because then everybody would say, sure, so that's what you mean? Really? That's not cool.
What they did in one of our papers was comparing a task with the resting state activity, and they were also always referring to a baseline activation. So is that the same principle? So
if you compare a task versus the resting state thing, then of course the control task, that depends then what kind of resting state people these were. So some people think that in resting state there are no cognitive processes at all involved. So then you don't, so for example, if the task is deciding between left and right movement and so on, and in the control task there's just nothing there, then of course you don't have to do visual perception, you don't have to make an internal orientation, judgment, and so on. So this is all zero. And then from task versus control, you just observe the brain areas that are involved if the brain is doing something versus nothing. So that's how I usually look at this contrast between task versus control. It's also a general quality check whether actually this worked. You have other people that think during the resting state you do mind wandering and all sorts kinds of things. Then you of course have a very badly constrained experiment, which is also of course sometimes the case when I look at task versus control things, because during rest people actually might do different things. Yeah, so they might think about that they really need to pee now and want to get out of the scanner or something, which they don't do when they actually doing the task. Or things. And then you have just a badly constrained experiment where you compare certain cognitive processes with other cognitive processes. Actually, there was Frank Jekyll, he always said that he believed that a lot of the activity in fMRI was related to suppressing your need for going to the loo, because he thinks that most people who are in there, at least for him, Frank Jekyll, was always that he needed to go to the loo from a certain time point, so that all this brain activation is just like, okay, I'm not going to the loo now. Anyway, so that would be task versus rest, but obviously the more interesting comparisons are one task conditions versus another task condition. So for example, consciously perceiving something versus not consciously perceiving something while being stimulated with the identical physical stimulus, so that you find the consciousness brain area. Yeah?
For the design, where you compare, for example, valid and invalid trials also fit into this kind of design, because like assuming you have an invalid trial of any task, I don't know, I think there might, like, I think there's like a hypothesis that there might be regions that have higher activation when like something is wrong, like not as predicted.
Now you have now you're conflating multiple things. So if something is not as predicted, that's of course you can have that. I don't know exactly what you mean by valid and invalid trials, but if you mean by that correct and incorrect responses, then of course you can have incorrect and correct responses also if something is happening that is predicted or not predicted, unless you're meaning the prediction about your own correctness. If you and if you predict all the time that you're always correct and then you suddenly make an error, then of course something was not as predicted. But so you can do this predicted versus non-predicted, of course. That would also be here, so that that would be then basically the cognitive process of interest would be the processing a prediction error. So you make a prediction and then you find that you're right versus you're wrong, and then you have to deal with that. And that's then this cognitive process is the other thing that you're doing, that you give a correct answer versus an incorrect answer. That depends a little bit because sometimes the correct and incorrect answer only exists in the experimenter's world and the participant is not really aware of that. This is often when people do kind of more judgment-oriented tasks where people don't get feedback and then the experimenter later on say they were correct or they were incorrect, but to the participant there was no correct or incorrect or whatever. If you're talking about feedback, then yes, you could do something. So you could, for example, have, if you want to make the case that people, if you have a hard task, and this is due to the fact that people really need to be attentive, for example, if you have these flanker tasks or Stroop tasks or something, then you could of course say that in the where they do the correct decision, their attention was in there, so the cognitive process was working. When the attention cognitive was working, if they did a wrong answer, then it was a momentary lapse of attention, so the attention was not active, and then you can find this attention. So in general, yes, of course, one can put all of these things in, I would say, into cognitive process analysis, and this is what I would actually be much more interested in hearing way more often, because then these things always make more sense. Because what happens now is that when people do cognitive neuroscience experiments, they tell you about the task and the control task, and they just tell you, and then you are supposed to make some sense of why they did it like that, but they don't tell you why they did it like that. Sometimes they do, if it's very elegant. So, for example, last week when I talked about this working memory task with this alphabetizing versus remembering, there was a little bit of a task analysis in there, but often they don't do that, and then and if it's not immediately obvious, then you might wonder why do they do that, or they just talk about their great task and later on tell you about some contrast that they made, and then show you some brain activity, and it's completely unclear what this is supposed to mean if you are not quite clear about what this control task that they contrast in the activity is actually about, and they didn't tell you what cognitive process they think are involved in the first thing. So that's then really where this whole mess in the cognitive neuroscience literature comes from. So please do task analyses if you do tasks. And this holds from, so I think where things are a little bit better in this regard is actually in for example, the sensory domains, for example, vision, because there people would then be interested. So a big thing is, for example, if you do categorization experiments, so you show tools versus, so inanimate objects versus animate objects, so tools versus animals or something, then vision people, like I when I was young, would say, yeah, you have these category differences, but you also have low-level visual differences. So what do you mean? And then can you really, did you really try to match the low-level aspects like the orientation, the frequency spectra, and so on? And then you get into this mindset of thinking about these cognitive processes, which are more basic visual processes in this sense, but at least you try to make a little bit of an effort. If things go to more high-level cognition, this often fades away. Yeah.
How relevant is the effect size, or what is that, the actual difference in activation between task and control task? So are we talking about multiplies, or is it already of interest if there's only a slight difference in activation?
Well, so if you mean, the question is a little bit what you mean by effect size. So a typical measure of effect size is a t-value, which you can rescale to Cohen's d. So this means essentially the difference in average activity against the level of noise. The thing is that it doesn't really matter. So if you only think in terms of t-values, the effect size doesn't matter at all. There you just need many samples, then it will be meaningful in terms of a statistically significant result. If you think in terms of Cohen's d, then it also doesn't matter, because then you can either say, okay, I only believe I only believe effect sizes of 1, so when the difference in means is as large as the standard deviation, but I believe also the difference in effect size of 0.10, so that's my criterion for having it meaningful. So thing is, one thing, you can't predict effect sizes, because you haven't done the experiment yet. Otherwise, if you look it up the literature, then you don't need to do the experiment again, because it was already done. The other thing is, if you want something significant in terms of get something out here, you just need to sample enough, and so I wouldn't say it matters at all.
Yeah, but as a researcher, for example, if I find something significant, starting from how big does the difference has to be that the researcher would say, okay, no, this is an interesting finding.
Yeah, I mean, this doesn't have to do that much with cognitive subtraction. This has a little bit more to do with the sociology of science, yeah.
Quantify it in any way?
Yeah, of course. I mean, so for a long time it was, if it's significant at 0.05, then it's meaningful. And if you go into brain imaging, people say, yeah, we have to correct for multiple testing, so then you need bigger effects. Then you have people that say, no, we want effect sizes, meaning t-values and associated p-values of smaller than 0.001. But then you can, of course, also make the argument that you get to p-values of 0.0001 for very small differences if you just have a high n. So in general, it's accepted as something meaningful if it's if p-values fall below a certain value, but that's more a question of statistical analysis, and from my perspective, but this has nothing to do with this. From my perspective, all statistics is quantification of uncertainty, and people should relax a little bit, and then it doesn't. It's just a quantification, and if you see that a certain result has a t-value of 1.5 or a Cohen's d of 0.25, then you know, aha, that's it. Interesting. And if it's highly significant, then you can say, oh, that's also very interesting. The problem is, of course, that you have these file draw effects and so on, that things that are not significant are not published and then not communicated. So, okay, but this has not so much to do with this, actually. Okay. So why did you bring this up in this context?
No, because if I read the paper, it's all about significances, and I just from when it starts to become really relevant. If you have, it's just about the difference, and the difference is very small.
Yeah, but small differences can also be important.
Yeah.
There is no correct answer. So if something is significant but also is just a small effect, then it's just a small effect. Of course, it's easier to answer these kind of questions in clinical context, where you can say, okay, if it makes a difference to the life quality of a patient, which you also need to quantify, then it's worth to use this drug. But in science,
the only way to quantify is through the t-value.
No, you can. So this, we're getting a little bit astray, but no, I mean, quantifying uncertainty, you use probability theory for that, and you can do this using classical frequentist theory, but you can also do this using probabilistic models per se, so Bayesian analysis. These are actually things that we will address more in the summer term when we do Bayesian inference, so quantifying uncertainty. And if you watch the GLM videos, so please don't watch the GLM videos, because you will have to have watched the GLM videos for the fMRI data analysis that we do in January. Watch the GLM videos. Okay, any more questions right now? Because then let's have a break, and after the break talk about this temporal order of stimuli.